Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Justin Essery. I'm an associate professor here at Rice University. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Will Hobbs, a postdoctoral fellow at Northeastern University's Network Science Institute. His talk is entitled Pivoted Text Scaling for Open-Ended Survey Responses, Dimensions of Attitudes on the Affordable Care Act. Will's talk will last between 30 and 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. And if you want to ask a question during the talk, that's fine. It'll show up in our Q&A window. But we probably won't answer anything that's not just a typical clarifying or not just a clarifying question until the end. A link to Will's paper and slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation. I will send those links just as soon as this introduction is finished. And now I'd like to welcome Will Hobbs to the IMC. Will, welcome.
All right, thank you, Justin. I really appreciate the opportunity to present here. And I'm excited to present this new text scaling method for open-ended survey responses. This is going to be on the Affordable Care Act, an application to that issue. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the background for the method, because that is the origin of the method. So this comes out of a broader book project that I have with Dan Hopkins at UPenn that studies public opinion on the ACA going back to 2009 and to the present. And so some background of the project is that, so we know that the ACA is probably the most important social policy in decades, and then it has concrete effects for millions of Americans. At the same time, it's a complex policy, and it has different impacts for different people. And so it's unclear whether it would have any policy feedback or opinion change. That's especially true because we know that attitudes on the ACA are really polarized by party ID. And attitudes, at least in terms of support or oppose, that hasn't changed much of it all since 2009. And so part of this project considers a variety of influences on public opinion on the ACA beyond party ID, including group interest, racialization of healthcare, and self-interest. And it does this partially through probing closed-ended survey questions, but also, and what's the focus here, is through open-ended survey responses. And so one amazing thing about data on the ACA is that there's great data. So there are over 10,000 responses going back to 2009. And because of this, it potentially documents the full history of public opinion on the ACA. The problem with this is that there's not really any systematic method for analyzing open-ended survey responses. Because of this, analysis tends to rely on hand coding or reading them. So this has been the case for a long time. So we've had these since the 20s and 30s when they were really popular. And a notable case of this is Converse 1964 with levels of conceptualization. And this is because methods like topic models are, for one, better suited to longer documents than you might have in an open-ended survey response, but also because they're sensitive to researchers' choices. So whether or not you choose 4 topics or 20 topics, that can have a large effect on the output. And automated ways of selecting topics can produce many uninterpretable topics, and that are very difficult to link to other survey responses. So if you have 500 to 1,000 responses, even if you train on a much larger corpus and then apply to a small panel, you can't really use 50 variables in a useful way. Because of this, we have a guided reading of responses instead of a systematic approach. So the contribution here is a unsupervised method for scaling open-ended survey responses in short text. Now I've named this canonical pivot analysis. I'll call it pivot analysis for short. And the goal of this is to scale text for broad ideas and well-powered estimates that we can then link to perhaps other survey questions, maybe train on a large corpus and apply the estimates to a very small survey to link to other opinions and behaviors, or to track changes in opinions and how people talk about a law over time. And one big advantage of this method is that there are very few rigid degrees of freedom. And because of this, it allows for objective discovery and measurement. To be clear, this method is for a specific kind of text data. So it's for short text data, including open-ended survey responses on a focused topic, and opinion statements in social media. So for example, a focused hashtag like Black Lives Matter or Yes All Women, including a personal opinion statement with that hashtag. It also works for both large and small data, even hundreds to thousands of responses. And that's because it's able to bring in information from out-of-sample sources to stabilize the scaling. Because this is a fairly data-focused method, I'll go ahead and jump into what the data is for the ACA. So in all of the surveys, they begin with the closed-ended response. So as you may know, a health reform bill was signed into law in 2010. Do you like it or do you not like it? And after you say favorable or unfavorable, then there's an open-ended question. Could you tell me in your own words why you don't like or do like the ACA? And there are over 13,000 responses to this question, and they're a mix of telephone and online surveys. Many of these come through the Kaiser Family Foundation, but also through Pew, iScout, a panel at Penn, and YouGov, which is a survey of activists. To give a few examples of these responses, so someone who supports the ACA might say everyone should have insurance. And someone who opposes might just say socialism. Now, the thing to take away from these responses is that including stop words, so things like, or words like the mean number of words in these responses was only 7. And out of 13,000 responses, about 4,500 people used only the top 100 words in the corpus plus one other word. So this poses a problem because existing methods struggle on short and here what are vague text. And so even if we wanted to use an existing method, they wouldn't necessarily work very well. And this includes topic models like LDA, CTM, STM, which are better for long documents and multiple cleanly separated topics. And as well as scaling methods, so methods that work kind of like nominate for text, like wordfish or correspondence analysis applied to text. And these are best for long and sophisticated documents on a fairly focused topic. At the same time, scaling methods, they're in the right direction. Here we have a focused topic on the ACA. We have a low-dimensional and polarized space, which is American politics. And we'd like to have few research degrees of freedom if possible. So because of this, similar to methods that scale text in legislatures, pivot analysis is going to compress variance using singular value decomposition. And this is going to be similar to PCA, but is going to upweight common words. And to be a little bit more clear about what these changes are going to do. So in existing text scaling methods, there's a common problem. This applies to topic models as well. And that's that common words tend to be split over many topics or many dimensions, and they don't tend to be scaled very well. They tend to be scored too close to the middle. So what these changes are going to do is going to split the common words more cleanly onto separate dimensions. It does this through two main fixes, and the intuition for these fixes is that it denoises the data, and then it zooms in on dimensions where we can distinguish the common words from each other. So one fix is just weighting that works like a regularization, and it's going to be kicking in for large N data like we have here. So 10,000 responses or 5,000 responses would be a good example too. And also it's going to bring in information from out-of-sample word embeddings. And this is really useful in small data. So what a word embedding is here is, so for each word in the corpus, we can take a matrix that's been trained on out-of-sample data. So for each word, there's going to be 200 numbers that assign that word a location in the English language. And we can use that matrix to then bring in some information on a word's general meaning into our data set, especially if we don't have enough occurrences of it in our data set. Now, this is going to be implemented in a way that has appealing properties. And the one that I like the most is that it has keyword identification. This is very common in topic models, but much less common and not usually supplied in scaling methods. Another nice feature is that the output is going to be based on the keywords, and rare words are going to have very little influence except in the relationship to common words. There are also other features like TF-IDF standardization. So that is not in the equations, but it's going to have something very similar due to the way it's set up. So very common words are only going to be influential if they're also somewhat specific. And as we'd like, there are going to be few research degrees of freedom. And there are also some appealing properties that are thought to be useful in a computer science work. So before I go into all of the method, I'll show you that it works. So first, for the first dimension of supporting of the text, on the left, we have what I labeled patient protection. An example of this response would be, it gives students the ability to maintain insurance and parents coverage. We're talking about pre-existing conditions. And on the second dimension, on the left, we have universal access. So talking about everyone should have access to healthcare. For the first dimension on the right, we have what I've labeled the role of government. So for example, talking about the government taking over, we're talking about the individual mandate. And the second dimension on the right is going to be talking about personal costs. So talking about money, premiums, deductibles, and also the middle class. And I wouldn't say that one of these is much more common among Trump supporters, and I'll tell you which one of those that is later. So there are several steps to this method. It looks a little bit complicated here, but it's actually fairly simple. So the key part of the method is a canonical correlation analysis that is a singular value decomposition. And some of this math here is just for tuning. There are actually very few steps to the method. So to give a little bit of background on CCA. So an example of this current use would be estimating correlation between the words between or before a word and after a word, and then estimating the meaning based on that context. And CCA here is linear regression with multiple dependent variables. And in this work, for example, by Dylan, which is the inspiration for this method, and I saw this presentation back in March and then adapted this for this method. So we can then train on all of these left and right context and take a word's meaning to be the specificity weighted average of that context. Now the method here is inspired by Dylan et al., but CCA has been manipulated in an unusual and very useful way. So for one, we're not going to be maximizing just correlation. It's going to be still compressing variance similar to PCA, but it's also going to be manipulated to use common words better. So to jump into that, so here I'm showing what is essentially the distribution of specific and vague or common and rare words in a standard text scaling. So usually a specific word is also going to be rare, and it's going to have a large influence on the text scaling. And vague and common words, they're going to be in the middle of the text scaling and have relatively little influence. Now, as an example of that in this data, we might have words like interference, regulation, and intervention. And those words are going to have an outsized influence on the scaling, when really we don't care so much about these slight differences in meaning there. What we do care about is a word like government. And we'd like to scale our text around a broad idea like government. And then if needed, to bring in out-of-sample data based on the same axes. So we scale our text based on the data we have. And then to fill in holes, we can bring in data from out-of-sample data like the word embeddings. So here, this is going to be done by splitting out the common words on one side of the input. And this will be called the pivot scores. So here it's showing that all of the rare words have been shrunk close to zero, and then we're left with the distribution of the common words. Once we've done that, once we've denoised the rare words and zoomed in on dimensions where we can distinguish the common words, we can then link that to the other view or the other input of the data, where the common words have been constrained to move with rare words. And so we match the distributions for common and rare words, or define common words based on all of the words, and then drag the rare words along with it. And once we've done that, the dimensions are defined based on common words. But here, the common words are still not particularly specific. And so it's helpful to unstretch the space so that we have essentially the same distribution of specificity. Now it looks similar to the way it would have before, but now that dimension has been defined using common words. So how is this done? So there are going to be, as I implied, two inputs to the CCA. And one of these is going to be standardized word co-occurrences. So here, M is a term document matrix. So in the columns, it's the words, and in the rows, it's the documents. And so the cross product of that gives us the word counts. And if we standardize that, or row standardize, so divide by the diagonal or divide by the word counts, then we end up with what are close to conditional probabilities. And so here a PCA of this X is a standard scaling method. And for example, in something like a topic model, if you were to take all the topics and then recombine them, it's possible to produce a matrix that's very similar to this PCA. Now the target here is going to be to take this PCA or this X and to pivot it towards a compression that is not far from PCA of that G matrix. So the word co-occurrence counts, but with the standard square root transformation. So the other side of this, that it's going to be the weighting function or the regularization for the based on word counts, is going to be the word embedding matrix, here it's W, multiplied just by the n-sample word counts, which here is D. And here B is going to be an exponent and G is just a subscript. And so these word counts are going to be raised to a power of B. Now note that there is some tuning guidance in the paper and that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But in practice, you want to raise B just as high as possible. And once you've done that, then you've denoised the rare words. So from here, we can put both of these inputs, so the standardized word co-occurrences and the weighted out-of-sample word embeddings, into the CCA. And here I'll show what that does. So if we raise B on the right side of the input, then here on the x-axis, we have the log frequency of a word, and on the y-axis is the weight in that compression. So here B is 0. If we raise B to 1, and then if we raise it to 4, now we have very little weight on the rare words on the left of that x-axis, and a large and flat weight on the common words. And this is really nice because at this point we've identified the keywords, and they are the words that the text scaling is based on. So that's the implementation of pivot scaling. From here, we unstretch the space and then apply those word scores to the term document matrix, just like beta is from a linear regression. And from there, we just standardize by the number of words. So here I'll show that this works better than existing methods, especially that it compresses variance in a way that's correlated with that closed-ended response. So here on the x-axis, these are the n dimensions of a 100-dimensional model for competing methods. And so we want the lowest dimensions to also be the most important. On the y-axis, these are the absolute values of lasso coefficients that are predicting the closed-ended response. And they've been scaled so that it also is correlated with, it also means that it predict that closed-ended response well. So for competing methods, including PCA and latent semantic analysis, we have a lot of information that comes up in the 4th, 5th, 6th dimensions. Now that's not wrong. There is information in the text. It's fairly high dimensional, but it's not necessarily very useful. And for pivot scaling, the 1st and 2nd dimension are very highly correlated with that closed-ended response, even though it's not been linked to the response in the training. And it turns out that those first 2 dimensions, they predict that closed-ended response, as well as 7 dimensions in a competing method like PCA or a topic model. So here are those keywords for the dimensions I described earlier in the presentation. So I gave those a label, but that's just my own label. And if you wanted to give it another one, you could use these keywords to label it yourself. And these keywords are what the dimensions are based on. So to the extent that rare words are related to this dimension, it's through their relationship with these common words. So these words include pre-existing conditions, parents, children, staying on their insurance, coverage, uninsured. And on the right for dimension 1, we have the role of government. And a keyword here is government and unconstitutional and run involved, and also medicine, socialized socialism. For the 2nd dimension, on the left, universal access. The keywords here are universal access, health, everyone, step in the right direction, and also single payer show up on this dimension. On the right for dimension 2 is the personal cost dimension. And here this is mostly talking about money, like premiums and deductibles, money, we have the working and middle class. There's also Medicare there. Earlier on in the ACA debate, there was some talk about the ACA taking money from Medicare. So here I'm showing the locations of the pivot scores in the scaling. Now, you shouldn't need to read the words here. It's just important to note that all the text scaling is based around these common words. So we estimate where the common words are in the space and then drag along the rest of the words with that. And the color here, this is based on that lasso I showed earlier. So the colors here, if they're separated, that means that we can summarize these text in 2 dimensions fairly well. So here I'll show how we can link that to a closed-in response in the rest of the survey. And here we train the text scaling on a large corpus and then apply it to a small panel. And again, dimension 1 here is the role of government versus patient protection. And dimension 2 is personal cost versus universal access. And that's just what pops out of the model. Here it means that if you talk about the role of government, you're unlikely to talk about patient protection. But you might talk about personal cost or universal access. At the same time you talk about personal cost, you're unlikely to talk about universal access. So here the first result is showing that changing opinion on the ACA is related to talking about personal cost more. At the same time, talking about the role of government or the patient protection, that's unrelated to whether or not opinions on the ACA changed. And this matters because between 2012 and 2016, that's when the ACA was implemented. And so talking about personal cost seems to be related to changed attitudes. In terms of voting, so both of these dimensions are related to voting for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. But only the second dimension is related to voting for Donald Trump versus the Republican establishment, which here is Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Chris Christie, and one of the candidates, blanking on it. So here, this second dimension that's actually a really large effect. So a 1 standard deviation change in this personal cost versus universal access is related to about a 7 percentage point increase in voting for Donald Trump versus those other candidates. In terms of voting for Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton, there's no difference in the text scaling. And it turns out there's no difference in any of the ACA-related questions. There are some demographic correlates, but that seems to be the extent of it. So I also show that we can measure changes in attitudes over time. So here on the x-axis, this is the year, and the y-axis is about how much emphasis we have on that dimension in the text. This is showing for respondents who are favorable towards the ACA in terms of how much they talked about patient protection versus the role of government. And so we see that before the ACA was signed, or in 2009 when it was being discussed in Congress, people weren't talking about pre-existing conditions and they weren't talking about staying on parents' insurance. But in 2010, that became a very large focus and was stable through 2015. Now here, for talking about the role of government among people who dislike the ACA, we see that in 2009 and 2010, there's a large degree of emphasis on this dimension that declines over time. And it turns out that we see some of that pop out in the personal cost dimension. So at the end of 2013, we see a small blip in talking about personal cost versus universal access. And this corresponds to the announcements of changes in health plans at the end of 2013 that would come into force in 2014. We also see evidence of this on Twitter. So I'm showing here the results from looking for words like canceled insurance and showing that those pop up at the end of 2013 and never go back down to prior levels. So that's it. Just some brief takeaways and next steps for this. I'll note that this text method, it's able to detect large shifts from abstract to concrete and policy-focused language. And it does find some small opinion changes, although most of the effects are just within party variation. And it does discover a substantial within party variation that explains voting for example, Donald Trump versus the Republican establishment. And this does look like some degree of policy feedback. So it's not just that it's only party ID. There is some responsiveness, at least in justifications or perhaps rationalizations for how people feel about the ACA. It also seems to look like ideology because this method would not pick up such organized dimensions if people didn't have some kind of structure in the responses. If they were just random responses, we would not have these organized dimensions. Now, I mentioned rationalizations in passing there. I will note that there are strong links between ACA attitudes and immigration, as well as race and ethnicity-related attitudes. And that doesn't come out in the text, and actually it's very rarely mentioned. At the same time, we have some other survey responses that can then link these dimensions I talked about to race and ethnicity-related attitudes, and then on to ACA attitudes. In terms of the bigger picture, this provides a method for summarizing open-ended responses. And it is an unfair comparison, and that's because this method here is designed for short political text. There are some remaining questions, including when to lean on more information from out-of-sample data. That's not influential here because the way this is set up, most of the action is coming from the weighting and regularization. But it does matter in much smaller data sets. So for example, hundreds to maybe thousands, that out-of-sample data is influential. But more broadly, this is a major improvement over guided readings because there are very few research degrees of freedom. And because of that, it creates the potential for a measurement tool. And I think that justifies adding more open-ended questions to survey research. There will be an R package. This is going to be pretty simple. It's just basic algebra. It should also be very fast and simple to implement. And I'm looking for users and data. So if you have any interest in this, please contact me and I'm happy to help. All right, thank you.
All right. Is Mets on? Yeah. Thank you, Will, for that presentation. At this point, excuse me, Will Hobbs is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And I'll get us started here with something I'm interested in. So you mentioned at the end of your presentation that this dimension on voting for Trump in the Republican primary appeared, it sort of looked like ideology, right? It appeared to be ideological. It's funny that you say that, though, because for two reasons. First, we'll go lowbrow, then highbrow. So on the lowbrow, and if you just sort of read the news and listen to pundits, watch the NewsHour, that kind of thing, you'll hear people say that Trump is not a particularly ideological person, that his supporters are not particularly ideological, they're more populist. And then on the highbrow end of things, I recently read a paper in PS by McWilliams that argues that the people who supported Trump in the primary were not, the ACA was not what they were voting on, right? It had to do with, I seem to recall the main predictors were this personality-based measure of authoritarianism. So, remember the old authoritarian and I forget what the other end of the scale is, distinction. Yeah. And then the other thing was fear of terrorism that activated non-authoritarian voters. And everything else that was in there was sort of irrelevant in the model. And so I'm looking at your results and I'm thinking about this experience and I'm like, one of these things is not like the other. So to what extent do you think that this text method is picking up on something that's sort of related to those issues? Or it's different than those issues? Is that a measurement problem? So what do you think about that?
So it does seem to be related, actually. So that second dimension is not just that it explains AC attitudes and voting for Trump versus the establishment. It's also related to being unstable in AC attitudes, which would be consistent with having less organized ideology. And so someone who was very opposed to the ACA, we just can't predict what they're going to say next time as well if they're scoring highly on that dimension. So I think that would be consistent. In terms of voting for the primary and terrorism and authoritarianism, I will say that in the general election, at least, it does seem to be related to, so change in AC attitudes is very strongly related to a change in vote choice from 2012. Actually, in this panel, it's more correlated with that change than any other issue, including immigration. So it's a little surprising to me that in the primary that might have been different. But I think it's also possible that this doesn't come out in the ACA response, the overall response, but there is a second dimension to the ACA attitudes that isn't clear in a interdimensional scaling of it that would pick up something that wouldn't come out in a overall scaling on the ACA.
Yeah, once we get into the general, I think the voting behavior changes a lot, right? Because then you're comparing this person to another party and their strategic considerations, and you may hate the guy, but you really, really hate the opponent and all that. Yeah. That's a whole different ballgame. I was really more thinking about like the primary, where you're choosing, one would think, among a suite of people who are essentially on your team.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. So here, I guess, well, one more clear explanation for that would be that there is some first dimension on how people support or oppose the ACA, and that does seem to be unrelated to the primary vote choice. But the second dimension here does distinguish that. And so that is one advantage of this over, for example, a supervised method that might simply link this to the closed-ended response.
I actually have a question about the supervised comparison in a second, but I want to go to some questions from the audience. So Matt Ward asked, first of all, interesting and useful method. I agree with his comment. I thought this was really interesting. What is the approximate minimum amount of observations or information needed to conduct this analysis?
So the short answer is it depends. So if you have a very polarized response pool, it can be 300 responses. If you have very activist and very very clearly Democrat or Republican, it can establish that first dimension well, and then it can use the out-of-sample data to fill in or to stabilize subsequent dimensions. If you don't have that organized, that polarized response pool, it's certainly more. I'm not sure exactly how many more. I would guess 1,500 is safe, at least in my experience, although it does depend on the type of question. So for example, on the ACA, it's more polarized. It's also more organized, especially in 2015 versus 2009. So if you train this on 2009, it's much more difficult to have a coherent picture of the text. But by 2015, as people have continued to think about it, it becomes more organized. On something like, or economic topics, it seemed to be to struggle more to have a picture, but I think that does reflect disorganization in how people think about certain issues. So this method, if there isn't a structure to the responses, it's not going to give you the result. And that's not going to change no matter. It's going to change very slowly as data increases.
Okay. I want to go on to another question from the audience. So this one's from Kartik Trivedi. I don't see why this method cannot be used for any opinion survey. Am I missing something? What are some data characteristics that one has to have to ensure before using this method?
See, so I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think the person's asking, I mean, I'm guessing, but I'm thinking the person's asking, why aren't you using this on all forms of text analysis? Why is this specifically only for really short, open-ended responses as opposed to, longer sort of maybe manifesto length documents?
Oh, I see. So it could be used on a manifesto document, but there you don't need it. You could use a standard method is the main point. Because there we have a lot of rare words that we can then leverage to pick up structure in the data. That said, it does seem to work well on other kinds of data. So I've applied it to news transcripts, for example. So if you find a specific key or a specific word, a seed word, then take the sentence before and the sentence after, it can work there. So I mentioned it for open-ended survey responses because I have a lot of good evidence that it works there, but it's possible that it could apply more broadly.
Yeah, I would wonder if it's more efficient even on the larger text. In other words, there may be a advantage that disappears as n goes to infinity, n being the length of the text, maybe not. That would be interesting to think about.
I think so.
Okay, so Andrea DeAngelis asks, I understand pivoted text scaling improves the accuracy of word scores with short text. In your application, you focus on a single issue. How would pivoted text scaling perform on larger corpora, including multiple issues? Oh, such as party manifestos. I didn't really read this question. That's an excellent question. One we just talked about. Is there still an advantage? I guess the answer to that is we're not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not sure yet.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't. I should have read to the end of that question before I started asking, but it was a good question. I have another question about, you mentioned in your particular ACA example, you mentioned that you had a closed-ended question and an open-ended question. And it strikes me that that means that you could, at least in part, do this as a supervised learning problem, right? You have some information. So is there any advantage or disadvantage of doing it that way? Or are you doing it this way to sort of demonstrate a proof of concept? Have you validated it using the supervised learning approach or what?
So the issue with supervised learning would be that, the ACA attitudes, they're already correlated with party ID. So I think it's a correlation of 0.665. So you will recover with essentially party ID by training on the closed-ended response. Now there is, I'm sure, some way to stop in the middle. Problem there is there's not an obvious stopping rule. So at what point do you want to bring it towards the closed-ended response or keep it farther away to maintain a higher dimensionality? And so that's the main reason I haven't used just supervised learning. Another issue there would be that sometimes you might have a response that's not particularly relevant in an open-ended survey response. So talking about, for example, Benghazi, which would be related to that closed-ended response, but you might not have enough density in the text to really link it to the policy attitudes unless you supervised it. And at that point, it could become influential. I don't think that's actually a problem here, but it could have been.
I mean, one thing I would kind of wonder is, and this is not about your project in particular, but more generally, I wonder about the extent to which text analysis methods add new information that we couldn't get out of a standard opinion survey. And maybe I'm not a text analysis scholar, so perhaps this has been done, but I'm not aware, at least, of any work that really tries to compare a supervised learning kind of approach where you're basically saying, well, I want to direct the text using some opinion questions I have versus a totally unsupervised learning process to see, okay, to what extent, first of all, does the text analysis add when you're just using the opinion survey? And secondly, to what extent does it recover different dimensions when it's unsupervised? Do you know anything about?
So I think let's see. So with supervision and then trying to have more dimensions, or supervised where you're producing a unidimensional output?
Well, there'd be two questions of interest. I think the first one would be, to what extent does, if you add text analysis to an existing sort of, you're doing sort of some sort of latent dimension extraction from a bunch of opinion questions versus doing that as part of a supervised learning process that involves open-ended questions, right? To what extent does the open-ended question add more information, add more variance, or improve the prediction accuracy? That'd be the first question. The second question would be, if you compare something like that supervised process that involves opinion dimensions and opinion questions and open-ended questions to just a totally unsupervised process where you are extracting whatever dimensions the algorithm finds, to what extent are those two similar? So those are sort of two different questions.
Yeah. I guess this links back to the point before about, so any kind of supervision process is just going to fit really well to that closed-ended response. And making it so that it doesn't fit well gives the researcher a lot of control over the output. And so we will find something, but it's hard to say that it's not our own bias in studying the problem. And I think that's something that comes up a lot in topic models. And that it is true that if you run a topic model, you're going to come up with, or it's possible to come up with interesting results more often than you would with this method. But that's also because you can run it many times over and then find the interesting results. And so I think that's also the case with the supervised method, where if you don't just collapse it to party ID, then it is possible to then run it many times to come up with interesting results. So there is some spectrum for discovery versus measurement, and I think this falls a little bit closer to measurement. At the same time, though, I do think that it should be used in combination with open-ended or closed-ended responses in some iterative way. So if we first run this, for example, on someone else's data on the ACA, it would be helpful to see what does come up in the text and then design a closed-ended response that allows us to better understand what that dimension means. And it also might be possible to base some topic model around this method so that it still has the regularization properties, but allows us to get into the text in more nuanced ways than we might get in just two dimensions.
So Matt Ward asked a follow-up. Can the method be used in short text such as tweets, for which There are no defined dimension from a specific hashtag. Can it be used to identify dimensions?
So technically, yes, but they might not be particularly meaningful. And that's because of the way this is set up to leverage common words. And so what tends to happen is that if you have many different topics in a text, then the only shared common words are very general. They do seem to be related to politics in some way, but they're so basic words that they're very difficult to interpret. They might be meaningful to a machine, they're not meaningful to me. If you do subset on a specific topic, then it works better on tweets. The problem that comes up there sometimes is that if you have many retweets, this method likes quotes. And that's part of the reason it works well in open-ended survey responses. Because in independent responses, it's very unlikely to have used the same words. But it's also very important when people do, perhaps because it's just messaging or it's something that's very important in what they've been asked about. For tweets, that's less obviously really important. It could just be copy paste. And when it does emphasize those quotes, then it can produce dimensions that are essentially a very popular tweet.
So Thomas Ball asked if you, meaning Will, are familiar with Bley and Heckerman's dynamic topic modeling approach, which uses latent Dirichlet allocation. How does your approach compare?
So I'm not familiar with that specific dynamic model. But in terms of LDA, it's possible to set up a topic model so that it produces similar results, not quite as compact and correlated with the closed-ended response. But you could use this method, for example, to first find the number of dimensions you should have in the topic model, and then fit a topic model that looks a lot like this method. But one advantage there is that if you just run the topic model, it's not obvious how many dimensions there should be. But I'm not familiar with that specific method.
Yoonjung Lee asked, would it be problematic to use data that contains multiple responses, such as Facebook comments, from the same person to multiple stimuli, think Facebook posts, on a given topic? And I think this relates somewhat to your earlier point about Twitter quoting and also sort of Twitter threads.
Yeah, at this point, I'm not sure. It's definitely something I'm really interested in looking into. On Facebook, I think there's less of a problem with quotes. So I do think it would work better on Facebook. I do wonder what happens if you allow people to have multiple answers to the same question. Because it's possible here that first and second dimension, it's picking up partially a difficulty in switching from an emphasis on the role of government to another, for example, personal cost, just in the same sentence. But if they were given a second or third response, then they would give you that personal cost dimension. And so part of this is giving a priority. So if you scale the text and then had a dimension that's all of the first responses and all of the second responses and all the third responses, it could give some kind of hierarchy. But I don't know yet exactly how that works, but I think it's an interesting application of the method.
One thing I would sort of wonder about is on Facebook and Twitter, you do have ancillary data. You have likes. Yeah. And in Facebook, you even have, angry face and wow face and all kinds of different information. And one of my students was recently talking to me about this, and it struck me that actually tells you quite a lot about what people, that would seem to be relevant in terms of if you're going to scale the people. It's not perhaps as important for scaling the text, but if you're scaling the people, then that seems to be pretty relevant. And you wouldn't have that necessarily in an open-ended survey.
That's true. There are definitely other sources of latent dimensions.
All right. Seeing no more questions, I think we'll close this session. First, I want to thank Will for being our presenter this week. I want to remind everyone that his presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast, probably a little later this evening for this particular one. If you'd like to share this presentation with your colleagues or watch it again later. I'd also like to advertise a talk next week. So next week on November 10th at noon Eastern Time, we will host a talk by Adeline Lowe of Princeton University. You can see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this upcoming talk. Will, thanks a lot for giving a talk this week. This is really interesting.
Thanks. I appreciate the invitation.
All right, and I hope to see everyone next week.